7th meeting of the 128th season took place online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 18th of May, 2021. Professor James Raven, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Professor Miriam Foote, who delivered the 2021 Homi and Firoze Rendire lecture entitled New Movements in French 20th Century Binding Design, The Importance of Patronage. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part. The President, Ms. Victoria Daly, Mr. Robert Laurie, Ms. Martha Romero, Ms. Robin Myers, Mr. Barry Mackay, and Dr. Jenny Stratford. The President thanked Professor Foote warmly for her paper.
May I accept this as a correct record? Thank you. Just have the cuts to get us on it. Thank you. So I should say that I am Meg Ford. I'm the past president of the Society, and I'm standing in this evening for James Raven, our current president, who's unable to be here this evening and very much regrets it. A medical issue is taken care of, and we wish him a very speedy recovery. It's a special evening this evening, partly because we're here in person. This is the first time since the beginning of COVID, and it's delightful to see so many people in the audience, and it's delightful to know that people are joining us remotely as well, so thank you for that. It is the first time we've done this hybrid session, so it will be a bit of a trial and error, so please do be patient with us. We're very grateful to the Society of Antiquaries IT specialist, Matthew, who's going to give us a hand as well and keep an eye on us. And we would welcome your comments afterwards as what you thought worked well and what we can improve on next time. It is a learning process. But it's also a special evening this evening because I will be presenting the gold medal to Michael Twyman, and I will start with that. So all of us working in the history of the book will know something of Michael Twyman, but few of us will know the full extent of his multifaceted contributions of life devoted to typography, printing, and communication. Professor Twyman has taught printing and design history at the University of Reading since 1959, and indeed it was he who established the university's course, Typography and Graphic Communication, combining intellectual and practical work. It was the first such course at a British university, and its success led to the establishment of a department of the same name in 1974. Over his long tenure at the University of Reading, he is now Professor Emeritus of the department. Michael has focused on 4 main areas of research: the history of lithography, 19th century jobbing and ephemeral printing, printing techniques and processes, and developing a graphic language, often as it relates to education. And Michael has not only assiduously researched in these areas, but he has thought deeply about their relevance and impact, proposing a schema for describing graphic language and reflecting on the long-term significance of printed ephemera. He has also been instrumental in bringing together scholars and practitioners in his roles as founder member of the Printing Historical Society in 1964, and served as its honorary president and vice president, founder and director of the University of Reading's Center for Ephemeral Studies, president of the Ephemera Society, chair of the National Printing Heritage Trust, and chair of the advisory committee of the St. Bride Library in London. Beyond the campus of Reading, Michael has taught at rare book schools of Virginia, Lyon, Wellington, and Melbourne. Importantly, Michael's teaching has always included handling physical materials wherever he teaches. It is no exaggeration to calculate that Michael has guided thousands of historians of the book, printers, designers, dealers, and collectors through his publications and teaching on 3 continents. Perhaps Michael's greatest contribution has been to the study of lithography, its processes, techniques, and products. Already in 1970, he published his Lithography 1880 to 1850, and in the spirit of handling physical books, I brought along Christie's own copy of that book. I am proud to say purchased in the very year of publication, 1970, as well as some other examples here, including one from the Society of Antiquaries Library. This is followed by works on color lithography, early lithographed books and music, and in 2000, he delivered the Panizzi Lectures on this subject at the British Library. Fortunately for us, he continues to work on lithography, and we may expect a study of the reproductions, lithographic reproductions of the Bayeux Tapestry at some point in the near future. Some of that research being undertaken here at the Society of Antiquaries. I began by alluding to activities perhaps less well known to us. Who among us knew that Michael was a printmaker, producing and, in his earlier years, exhibiting and even selling his artworks? The Bibliographical Society is not the first to honor Michael. He has also been awarded the Pepys Medal for outstanding contributions to ephemera as long ago as 1983. And in 2014, he received the Sir Misha Black Medal for his contribution to design education. On behalf of the Bibliographical Society, I now ask Professor Twyman to step forward to receive the Society's Gold Medal.
I've been told I may say a few words, and there will be very few indeed, I have to say. But I'm deeply honored to receive this particular medal, more, if I may say so, than the other medals that you mentioned. And that's partly because it recognizes lithography as a discipline. And I'd like to think that I played some part in establishing that process as such. It's also particularly touching because, and no other people here perhaps know this, that my first public lecture was to the Bibliographical Society. None of you could possibly have been there in 1966 or whenever it was. But I say that because to me, this is the tail end, as it were, of my career. But in a sense, it started here. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. A very happy occasion. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We will, this evening, just going on from our other special reasons for this evening, is that we have a new format this evening, and we have a panel of grant recipients. So as I hope you all know, the Society does give grants and bursaries, and we've never actually invited, well, we have invited individuals, but we've never had a panel of them to hear about their current work. And so we thought this was a way not only for them to be able to present something to us, but for us to really see, what our work is going towards and supporting. So very pleased that we have 3 grant recipients this evening who will present us with it. So they will each speak for about 15 minutes. We will have then a short time for questions afterwards. And again, in the hybrid link, obviously we will recognize speakers in the audience, but if you could still state your name, it will be handiest for us. And those online, you're also able to ask questions, and our secretary, Karen Lieber-Hertz, will field those questions. For people in the audience, you will need to wait for a microphone, so just hold on for that for a moment. But before we move on to opening the panel, I just want to give you a little bit of news. We have some other events for you as well. First of all, on Thursday, we are hosting an event at Middle Temple, and thanks to Renee Satterley, who's here, is both a participant and a host, called The Book That Changed My Life. And who can resist, attending a lecture like, or a panel like that? So again, we're going to have 4 people who will tell us their stories, and some of them will actually bring works with them that as examples of books that did change their lives. And of course, we're all in this work together. So I think we all, have had a book, that did change our lives, and it's, we'd love to hear about that. So depending on their reaction to that, we may even have that as a forthcoming series, and to be repeated with different stories every time. So that's on Thursday. Please go to the website and register. That's also available to be joined online, so you don't have to be there physically if you can't make it. We're also in the plans of a process of planning a winter visit, and this will be a virtual visit. We don't know yet where it is, but again, stay tuned to the website. Plans are still developing. And actually, before that, then I just call your attention to the Panizzi lectures. that will be delivered by Cynthia Brokow on woodblock printing and Chinese book production. And the first of that series of 3 will be held on the 30th of November at the British Library. Also a hybrid event, so you can book tickets to be present online. They're free, you just need to book, or also just sign up for a link to join online. And then we hope later in May to reactivate something that we had planned that had to be canceled because of COVID, and that's a bibliographical skills workshop that will take place in Manchester. And we're grateful to Julianne Simpson, a council member, for planning that. And we hope now in May, other things permitting, that we'll be able to go forward with that. So now, after that rather long introduction, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist of this evening. I think I've already said this, that we're going to have each 15-minute presenter and then a series of questions just directly after each one. Eduardo Fernández Guerrero is a doctoral fellow in history at the European University Institute in Florence. He holds a degree in classical philology from the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid and a master's also in classical philology from the Universidad Complutense of Madrid. His doctoral thesis studies the circulation and uses of the Apocalypsis Nova, a text combining prophecy, theology, and sacred history that became widely popular in early modern Europe and beyond. He was an early stage researcher at the Spanish National Research Council and has been a visiting fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa and the Catholic University Leuven. His wider interests I've really kind of lost it after all this talking. His wider research interests include early 16th century Venetian printed books, early modern church reform, and Mediterranean interreligious contact. So, Eduardo, please address us.
I'll switch for a second to this. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the presentation, Meg. And again, thank you to the Bibliographical Society and its members for the support that they have generously given to my work. Those who visit the Church of San Pietro in Montorio in Rome are often puzzled by an odd, almost hidden depiction of a book. Under the altar of the Borgherini Chapel, Sebastiano del Piombo painted a sealed book around 1523 with a small card reading "Aperietur in tempore," "It shall be open when the time comes." The book is barely visible because of its position, and yet it sits in a key place within the chapel's pictorial program and is placed, like relics traditionally are, under the altar. A book, therefore, portrayed as a relic to be unsealed and revealed when the time comes. My research focuses precisely on the circulation and readership of that book, better known as Apocalypsis Nova, or New Revelation, a series of visions blending prophecy, theology, and sacred history, reportedly given by the angel Gabriel to a Franciscan friar named Amadeus around 1481. Its main prophetic element, the arrival of an angelic pope who would reform the church and usher in a golden age of peace and justice, would contribute greatly to its popularity. From the reported discovery in 1502 of the original manuscript to the copies made in Mexico and India in the 17th century, I studied the ways in which its authority was built, used, and contested in religious, intellectual, or even political contexts throughout Catholic Europe. Today, I would like to focus on one of its fundamental elements, often ignored by the scholars who have worked on the Apocalypsis Nova, which is the relationship between the text and its material support, or in other words, the links between manuscript production and readership. But first, let's go back to San Pietro in Montorio. It was there, according to some later traditions, that Amadeus had received his revelations, perhaps even at the cave upon which Bramante would be decades later would have built his famous Tempietto. It was there that they were written, these revelations, and it was there that 2 decades after, a group of cardinals and theologians gathered in secret to open the freshly discovered original manuscript and read it for the first time. That is at least according to the letters of a Franciscan theologian named Giorgio Benigno Salviati, who was charged with making the first copy from the original. Unsurprisingly, this original soon went missing, and all that was left was a copy or copies deemed to be corrupt with interpolations by Salviati himself. I will return later to the problem raised by these interpolations and these accusations, but despite them, the Apocalypsis Nova nevertheless reached the libraries of cardinals, kings, and queens alike in the very first years of its circulation. Research on the Apocalypsis Nova has focused so far on issues such as its authorship or its relationship to artists such as Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael. This attention to the intellectual genealogy of the text, however, has led to a perception of the Apocalypsis Nova as a somehow disembodied, abstract, ever-constant text, with little to no attention to it as a book, or in other words, to the material aspects of its making and reading. I therefore undertook the task, helped greatly by the support of the Bibliographical Society, of doing a comprehensive search for manuscript copies of the Apocalypsis Nova. Considering both partial and full copies without chronological limits led to the discovery of 41 new copies from the previously known 63. All 104 were examined and briefly described, including codicological aspects such as watermarks, quire formation, catchwords, etc., together with a transcription of all texts bound together with this manuscript, with the Apocalypsis Nova in these manuscripts. This is a sample of the catalog. Besides this, a list of lost copies was drawn, pushing the number of copies of the Apocalypsis Nova that ever existed to 128. The resulting 300-page catalog, which does not include translations, not only sheds light on the material elements that allow the act of reading the Apocalypsis Nova and their change over time, but also shows the reading practices and mechanisms of book circulation it was subject to. It constitutes, to my knowledge, one of the very few cases of a systematic description of the same text throughout almost 3 centuries of copies. Now that I have briefly presented the Apocalypsis Nova and summarized some of my archival work on it, let me just raise 2 of the questions that have emerged from my research on it. First, the diachronic change of manuscript production and reading in the case of the Apocalypsis Nova, and secondly, the nature of its relationship to the manuscript format. Sadly, we don't have enough time today to discuss the transmission of the Apocalypsis Nova in terms of quantitative codicology as much as it could be done for such a small corpus. However, this graph and map summarizes much of it. The Apocalypsis Nova was most frequently copied in Italy, and it experienced 2 popularity phases with a clear stagnation between 1540 and 1610. Paratextual elements surrounding the Apocalypsis Nova allow us to reconstruct some of the ways that readers engage with it, while their combination with codicological aspects often sheds light on the way that makers and scribes, who were most often readers themselves, considered these revelations. For example, in the earlier phases of its circulation, mostly in the first half of the 16th century, copies are more likely to contain notes indicating belief in the truth of Amadeus' revelation. See, for instance, Niccolò Begani's distichs to one of the copies he prepared, now kept at the Biblioteca Marciana, describing it as an arcane work full of the Holy Ghost, revealed by the angel Gabriel. Or instead, Begani's contemporary, Bernardino dei Conti, a protonotary apostolic and lawyer of both laws, who longed for the arrival of the angelic Pope, as he writes in the copy he commissioned in 1525. Over time, however, the modes of reading and the types of copies start to differ. If the earliest copies would be presented almost in a single block, without any indication of the start of a new chapter, here called raptus or raptures, later copies would tend to become more clearly articulated, adding a new series of subsections and reference signs to render consultation much easier. As you can see here, this is two copies of the same fragment of the same passage of the text with over a century difference, and the development of all these like reference signs in the margins or system of revelatio instead of raptus and so on. This trend runs parallel to the development of elaborate indices in later manuscripts, such as this one, which is the manuscript copied at the Franciscan convent of Santiago de Tlatelolco in Mexico, now at the Bancroft Library, where three relatively long indices were drafted of passages from the Holy Scripture cited, songs and hymns in the book, or a general table of contents, and yeah. However, in contrast to these models of intellectual engagement with the book, the late 17th century stands out within the tradition of the Apocalypsis Nova for the rise of collection copies, I would say. Some lavish exemplars without any signs of active reading, indices, or reference systems, a type of book actually particularly common in aristocratic collections. As the popularity of the text rose, so did its status as a rare book, and the value did not depend anymore on its contents, but rather on the social convention around it. These copies capture a certain perspective over the Apocalypsis Nova, that of the makers. When Begano produces his lavish copies and instructs them with poems in praise of Amadeus and his holiness, this certainly reflects his own reading of the Apocalypsis Nova. However, as the scribe of 5 similarly composed manuscripts, his carefully crafted exemplars and their paratext guided and conditioned the reading experience of future readers who approach his manuscripts. Ultimately, the very self-explanatory conclusion of this is that the same text was read differently at different times by different people, and that for manuscript traditions, there is a dialogic relationship between production and readership, where one constantly influences the other. One thing, however, within this change remained equal through time, despite all of these different readings, which is the manuscript format. The circulation of the Apocalypsis Nova constitutes a quite unique example among early modern texts. It was never printed, and yet these revelations circulated as a manuscript from the very early years of its discovery in 1502 up to the 19th century. What were the implications of such wide manuscript circulation in contrast to the printed book? What were the reasons for it to never have seen the press? First, there is a question of authority. When confronted with texts circulating both in print and manuscript format, scholars have traditionally pointed to printed books as some authoritative, stable, and widespread versions. However, while a growing body of scholarship has challenged this, highlighting the instability of the early printed book and texts, the text circulating solely on manuscript form raised a different set of problems and questions. How was authority and reliability achieved for the Apocalypsis Nova? How did scribes and those involved in the making of copies seek to create an authoritative version? And how did readers complement their efforts? If we consider how the Apocalypsis Nova was deemed to be riddled with interpolations added later by Salviati, as I mentioned before, it doesn't come as a surprise that many readers found all copies, found in older copies a more authoritative version of the text, perceived as closer to the original, now lost, than their more modern counterparts. See, for instance, this copy owned by the Spanish king Philip II, one of the earliest copies made in northern Italy in the 16th century, which was stored in the reliquary room of the monastery of El Escorial, together with other autographed books by saints like this 8th century copy of Augustine's De Baptismo Parvulorum, on the basis solely of its apparent antiquity, and which was reported, the copy of the Apocalypsis Nova, to be among the most authoritative and purest versions of the text by early modern readers themselves. However, beyond the search of early copies, the Apocalypsis Nova textual tradition stands out for some proto-philological practices of readers who very often procured several copies of the text in order to compare them and identify potential interpolations. These practices shed light on the complex information networks of libraries and private book owners available to readers and scribes who often documented not only variants themselves, but even the source and signature of the manuscript they originated from. It is hard to discuss the wide array of cases and instances of these practices here today, but it's hopefully clear that the Apocalypsis Nova provides another example of the crucial involvement of readers in the production of books in the early modern period, or rather, the blurry lines distinguishing scribes, manuscript makers, readers, in the case of texts whose traditions exist solely on manuscript form. There isn't much time left to consider the question of why it was never printed, and this is something perhaps for the later discussion. But let me just say a few words about the reading experience of the handwritten word as opposed to the printed book. Manuscripts are always instinct with the presence of someone else, as a second orality, as Walter Ong says. Either the author, the scribe, or the reader, and in the Apocalypsis Nova one could say the presence of an angel. The traces are generally much more explicit in the handwritten pages than those printed. The human variation is here the opposite of the standardized, clear writing and reading. As Harold Love somewhat reluctantly writes, there is something remote and impersonal about the well-constructed typographic page that is the price that it exacts for permitting us to read at high speed. Revelations and prophecies such as Amadeus' alleged visions, written in first person, were built around the rich, dense moment of the encounter between human and divine. It is not surprising, therefore, to see a preference for this format, which enhances like no other the presence of the absent, and which exists not only as a record of the revelation, but as its physical proof and recreation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for that fascinating introduction to your topic. It's not something I myself knew about. So we can open it to questions from the audience, either in person or online. As I said, if you are in person, just wait for a microphone to be brought to you. And in any event, please do state your name at the beginning. While we wait for people to kind of mull over that, I did have a question myself, actually two observations. One, you talked about the wide distribution, and for any individual manuscript, any individual copy, is there evidence of it traveling very widely geographically, or did they actually stay in a fairly close geographic circle?
I would have to check my notes, but what I can say is that there is evidence of people traveling, and people traveling far to access a copy, and people accessing copies far away from where they usually were. From both cases, I'm thinking from Germany to Italy, or from different sides of Spain, within Spain. I cannot imagine it's hard to reconstruct that very early 16th, 17th century phase of the movement of manuscripts. When you retrace sort of like the history of each manuscript within a collection in a library, you often get up to the 18th century or something. I could think about it, but I don't.
Just curious if it struck you about that. Yeah. Very good. And I'll go ahead and ask my second question, or rather more of an observation. I saw when you were just showing us your notes on any particular manuscript, that wonderful binding. I'm sure Miriam would have something to say about that, but you weren't dating that. So is that intentional?
Well, the copy itself is dated. As you can see in the last picture, it's dated from 1527. I am not an expert on bindings, and my training is that of a Latinist and philologist. But no, there is like plenty of work to do about those cases as well.
Because that would be another clue as to its circulation and use. Anyway, like a fascinating one. Yes. David McKittrick, I can say your name for you. Anyway, we need a microphone. Just one moment, please. Just in the center, in the middle.
Thank you very much indeed. The binding you showed on that Copenhagen copy was extraordinary because it's right at the beginning of what you were talking about. Because it looks pristine. All right, it's made up of bits and so forth. But it looks quite different from the binding you showed much later, that later Italian binding. And I wonder if you could reflect a little on the history of this copy. Did it come through a collection in Copenhagen, or how? Can you remember?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. This copy was bought in 1961 by the Royal Library of Denmark from a Danish antiquarian. The copy itself seems to be from southern Italy. It's bound in a page of breviarium in this type of, what's the name? There are reasons to think that this type of breviarium was composed in southern Italy. So that, in combination to the watermark that points to, if I remember correctly, Marigliano, seems to suggest that it may come from southern Italy.
Thank you. I think I saw another hand here, but so that, yes, please. One moment.
Thank you very much for that, Eduardo. That was really good. I'm Jacob from St Andrews. This is quite a sort of just simple question, but just how lengthy are these texts? Are they quite compact, or are they big, bulky volumes?
I was mentioning these letters by Giorgio Benigno Salviati in the beginning. He himself describes the book as big as the City of God of Augustine. It's usually around 200 folios. And just to add something to that, usually it takes scribes, because often scribes would write down how long it took them to make a copy. Usually 3 to 4 weeks, if not more. So it's a significant text. It's not a short. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, I thought Miriam had a question. Anyone else, or yes, Karen? Someone online? Matthew, can you?
Thank you. Did you mention the name of the illuminator of the last slide?
Did I mention the name of the illuminate? This?
Yeah.
No, I am not aware of who illuminated this. And there is actually a conversation about this potentially being a copy-paste from a previous engraving pasted here. But no, there's no.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we will thank Eduardo again and move on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we just bring up our next presentation. I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Yelda Nasifoglu. She is an early career researcher in the history of early modern mathematics and architecture and an associate member of the Faculty of History at Oxford. She was trained as an architect in New York, studied history of science, medicine, and technology at Oxford, and received her doctorate in architectural history from McGill with her dissertation, Robert Hooke's Praxis, Reading, Drawing, Building, in 2018, which she is currently turning into a book. She's been a researcher with the AHRC-funded project Reading Euclid's Elements of Geometry in Early Modern Britain and Ireland, and is one of the editors of Hooke's Books database. So, Yelda.
Thank you for the introduction. Are you able to hear me? That's me. Oh, here. Fantastic. Thank you. I'd like to start also with a note of thanks to the Society for their support of my work. I will not be able to present that part of my research as it has been delayed by the pandemic, but now that I've been able to make it to the UK, I hope to be able to report to you on that when I will have undertaken it. Now, my title is Tracing the Circulation of Mathematical Books in Early Modern Britain Through Book Catalogues, which is not as explanatory as I would have liked. Perhaps it would have been more accurate to say tracing the circulation of mathematical ideas through book catalogues, so that it doesn't sound like it's about ticking off math titles in book catalogues. It may be helpful to contextualize this research, how it began, what it aims to achieve, and also to consider the weaknesses of its approach and share a few ways in which I think these can be remedied somewhat. To go really back, as mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on Robert Hooke's architectural work, especially its intellectual connections to his scientific activities. I had been particularly intrigued by how Hooke learned the craft of building outside of the traditional apprenticeship system, that is, without learning hands-on at the construction site. A clue was provided by Joseph Moxon, who in his mechanic exercises in the volume on bricklaying published in 1700, to be specific, mentioned that Hooke had discovered the upside-down arch system for foundations in Alberti's treatise on architecture and used it in his design for the Montague House, which, as some of you may be aware, later became the first building of the British Museum. So that's a Hooke building. Now, this led me to look more closely at Hooke's library and how he and others used books to learn craft skills. Hooke famously said in an unpublished work, alas, that natural knowledge could be sought in three places: first in books, secondly in men, and thirdly in the things themselves, i.e. through the perusal of books, the consulting of men, and the examination and trial of things. And we can find cases where Royal Society Fellows are discussing classical works of history in search of cement recipes. It's been pointed out that Hooke had a preference, in architectural books at least, for more practical titles than grand theoretical works. This made me wonder how much of this was actually a preference. Did he simply not have access to those theory-heavy treatises, or was it his choice? We are lucky that several of Hooke's lists of desiderata from book auctions have survived, and I was able to match them to specific catalogs to see other works that were available to him, but he chose not to purchase. Now, by the way, this part of this research can be found on our collaborative website with Will Poole and Phyllis D. Henderson on Hooke's book. So there you have the list of the desideratas and the auction catalogs that they match. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the site, I hope anyway. We've been keeping it alive. So it includes the searchable database of the 1703 auction catalog, as well as other titles that bear his ownership marks and that are not mentioned in Bibliotheca Hookiana. Now, according to the desiderata, Hooke did have access to some of the more theoretical treatises, which he did not bid on. But considering about 30% of the extant titles associated with him are not listed in Bibliotheca Hookiana, we cannot be at all certain that he did not own those titles at some point. So this is where looking at book catalogs becomes a bit tenuous. Now, book catalogs can also be useful in terms of identifying how libraries and specific collections can become distributed fields of influence. While in school, Hooke famously learned Euclid in the library of Richard Busby, the headmaster at Westminster School. A comparison between their libraries in terms of their mathematical content revealed an overlap of about 50%. So Hooke had about 50% of the titles that were in Busby's library. There's some work to do to be more assertive about this. It could be that those were the only titles available at that time period, but it is also possible that collections exert influence well outside of their walls. Another progenitor of this research is indeed the AHRC-funded Reading Euclid's Elements of Geometry in Early Modern Britain and Ireland project based at Oxford in 2016 and 18. In that project, my colleagues and I studied the reception of this classical work on geometry by examining editorial, educational, and readerly practices in Britain and Ireland up to 1700. In particular, we examined extant copies of the book for material evidence that showed how and for what purposes the text was read. Yet examining these copies alone was presenting less than an accurate picture of how and to what extent the text was circulated during this period. For instance, none of Hooke's around 30 copies of Euclid have survived. In order to understand better the circulation of these Euclidean titles, I began to survey contemporary book catalogs in manuscript and print of personal and institutional libraries to determine which editions were particularly popular, and in cases where information on the background of the owners was available, to understand the types of uses these books may have been put to. And that's how the catalog of catalogs began. And it rather soon got out of hand. I was trying to stop at 1700 and expecting there to be a few hundred book catalogs, and now I'm up to 1912, and it's not finished. Now, at the moment, it's not public just because I'm still cleaning it up, but eventually it will be made public for everybody's use. And what it includes is, it's a relational database for those who are more technically interested in this kind of thing. But I'm thinking of playing around with the kind of database type it is. And of course, I've also been collecting the titles, the copies as well. And when available, multiple copies of the same title, because I realized that each catalog, each copy of the catalog is actually unique, because people have scribbled notes in them, purchases that they would like to make, prices that were paid, and in some cases, indeed, the names of the purchasers. So each of the catalog, each of the copy of the catalog is treated as a separate book. What kinds of material are included in this? So in print, I have been including catalogs of institutional libraries, and I realized soon that I will need to curb this somewhat because books have been written on Cambridge Library, and there's no way I can include all of those catalogs, especially the manuscript catalogs. But there are some institutions that no longer exist, and their catalogs are particularly interesting, like the Scion College, for instance. And general catalogs of printed works, bookseller catalogs, some of these are for trade, some of them for retail, auction catalogs, of course, sale catalogs of libraries of individuals sold without auction, bequests, advertisements by booksellers or publishers appended to books, bibliographical lists. These are books that are recommended to each other, to people. In manuscript, they include personal library lists, wills and inventories that include book titles, lists of desiderata, like hooks from auctions, and shopping lists that sometimes people sent to friends via correspondence. Catalogs of confiscated libraries are especially interesting. During the Civil War, Catholic libraries on the continent, because a lot of mathematicians, Catholic mathematicians, were expelled from Oxford, and they actually ended up in Rome, and they were continuing their mathematical activities under the Jesuits, but they were English or Welsh or Irish, actually. Catalogs of institutional libraries. I think I recently saw like the Glasgow Library. There's a manuscript catalog long before there was, of course, a print catalog. And I'm also interested, of course, in how books were sent overseas, like the Levant Company. There are library catalogs of the Levant Company in Istanbul and other places. And there is some circulation of material with India as well. For instance, Hooke mentions algebra book or Indian algebra book that was brought to him by a captain. I haven't been able to locate what this book was, but it came from India. And of course, in manuscript, bequest institutional libraries, which again, I have to somehow curb, or maybe when other people can contribute to this, because there are many librarians who can do a much better job at this, who know their own college libraries much better. Now, just looking at these book catalogs is actually not enough, I found. Because there are many cases where individuals like women are underrepresented in terms of the survival of book catalogs. So do we assume they didn't have books? No. So somehow we need to balance this with, I think the current theme, the current term is distant reading and close reading, but as an architect, I'd like to use it as a bird's eye view and street view, so that we can look at these sort of meta catalogs and look at how these catalogs function, but also treat the individual copies of books that bear ownership marks and include those in terms of the circulation of ideas. So how can this be done? I'm experimenting with reconstituting library catalogs from ownership inscriptions and also from hammer copies of auction catalogs. So I know, for instance, the catalog of the Royal Mathematical School has not survived, but we know that in the meeting minutes of the Christ Hospital, we know that they gave money to Paget to go to an auction, the auction of Jonas Moore, actually, to purchase books for the school library, and I know which books that he purchased. So we can kind of, reverse engineer the library, at least partially, the catalog of the Royal Mathematical School. So, just to, so we have the in fragment lists as well in this meta database. Now, another thing that perhaps this approach, this bird's eye view approach, misses are the connections between catalogs. So we can treat these catalogs as self-contained, as if they're like singular buildings, but they can actually be connected. And I will give one example. And this is something that I discovered by accident, so who knows what other researchers are discovering on their own. On the left, we have the list of Bibliotheca Savilliana, Henry Savile's bequest to the Bodleian, well, not the Bodleian Library, but to Oxford in 1619 when he formed the Savilian professorships. On the right, we have Dorchester's catalog, which is now at the Royal College of Physicians. And I'm just going to draw your attention to one copy, well, two copies of the same book. It's the 1533 Greek edition of Euclid. And we see that somebody has, for Dorchester, I assume someone other than Dorchester, went to Savile's library and actually copied Savile's annotations into that copy. So we know that these catalogs can be supplemented with identifying these kinds of patterns in individual books and show influences across different institutions and across different personal libraries. Just more copied annotations. Where I am at this point is actually, I'm here, I arrived a couple of days ago, and the Bibliographical Society grant is for me to study the manuscript catalogs at the British Library and at Cambridge University Library. So I'll be going through the manuscript catalogs, book lists, and actually go through them, because a lot of them are dated approximately, so I'll try to figure out, maybe date them and see how they can kind of fit into this catalog, because I'm trying to stop it at 1700, but it's very difficult, of course, to be exact when you're dealing with such material that's not dated. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Yalda. Gosh, what a fascinating area of research, and I think that probably almost everyone in this room can't wait to use the database, because it kind of fits into so many areas of book history. Again, please do raise your hand and wait for a microphone for questions from the floor, or raise your hand virtually if you're online. And forgive me because I don't know that much about the database, but so you're digitizing these, or how can one actually understand the contents of these, and particularly as you're building these links that you just so effectively showed us?
It's actually personal research, a lot of it, but I have, the problem is current catalogs are very, they're kind of messy in the sense that there are multiple copies on EBO with separate titles, although they are to the same book. And so I have been kind of going through each one in EBO and kind of cleaning it up and kind of identifying the same book. And in some cases, one has 80 pages and one has 20 pages. It's just that 20-page one is missing pages, or other catalogs have mixed in. So it's kind of trying to kind of tease out what's going on in each of these copies. So yeah, I've been using EBO. I have been also looking at actually physical copies of a lot of these things and actually photographing them and going through each of them and trying to see their mathematical content. So it's a lot of work, but COVID, stuck at home, what else?
Exactly.
We do.
And for an eventual user of the database, though, how much detail will they be able to get out? Will they actually be able to look at every page? Or do you have links to EPO, or how is that working?
I think at this point I'm trying to look at what's feasible. The biggest obstacle is copyright and kind of the institutional willingness to kind of share their copies, right? But I have been spending a lot of time taking sort of digital humanities workshops, going through them, try to see standards and sort of triple IF standards, like what needs to be done, what kind of funding would be needed to digitize all of these. The copies that I have are less than perfect, the ebook copies from microfilm. And looking at the actual copies is problematic. Like I'll have to go to the British Library and ask for permission to see the hammer copies, each of them, because they're very fragile and they're not on the high list for conservation. So there are a lot of those kinds of issues. At this point, what I would like to do is release the metadata catalog so that people go and know whose copy of that catalog exists and where it is. But eventually, I think it would be more useful if you can compare pages. For instance, at the Grolier Club, I saw the Macclesfield copy of Bibliotheca Hookiana with a lot of marks. So it could mean that actually a lot of the books in the Macclesfield collection actually came from Hook's library, and we just weren't aware because Hook didn't annotate all of his books. So it's also useful for tracking provenance. That could be useful for others than myself. And I think it would be ideal to do that, but I'm not sure as an individual I can accomplish that. I think I'm building towards a larger project that I would love to have collaborations on, and to make this a bigger, more useful tool to understand provenance and understand the circulation of these books.
Yeah, terrific, good, well, thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience, either in person or online? Karen, you have one, just the microphone in the front. Matthew, do you have the microphone? Yeah. Or here.
So Gazwan Boutros is asking, how easy is it to find direct evidence of Robert Hooke's library other than the catalogues, as we know that most of his possession was not looked after well after his death?
We have recorded all the extant books that are from his library have some kind of a sign that show his ownership. In some cases, and Giles Mandelbrot has done a very good study of Sloane's purchases from Hooke's auction. So he was able to track some of those to him, and some of them are not marked at all. So Hooke did not like marking all of his books for some reason. In some cases, they're rebound, and he liked writing his name in the cover, and the back and front cover, and that's gone now. So we can never know. But yeah, it's very difficult. It's a case-by-case situation.
There's another
Yes.
online question from Barbara Bienes. Do the sale catalogues, especially those of the private libraries, usually list mathematical works in manuscript? My impression is that the emphasis is more on printed material than on manuscripts.
What I meant by catalogues in print and manuscript is the catalog itself could be a printed catalog or a manuscript catalog of printed works. Getting into, and it's been a question that I'm trying to answer for myself, whether I would like to add manuscript lists of manuscripts, if that makes sense. And it quickly gets out of hand. It's already a bit out of hand. And so I'm trying to curb it, but there's always room for growth. My goal is to do something self-contained that can be expanded upon rather than do a half job of disparate material. So trying to be thorough in terms of catalogs of printed works, but there are cases where manuscripts are listed, and in one case, I'm trying to remember which one, they have actually listed the names of the purchasers of the manuscripts so that they can be tracked down later on. So I've seen 3 copies, each containing the names of the purchasers of the manuscript. So they were kind of worried, I suppose, in terms of this material being lost to knowledge.
Good, thank you. If there are no other questions, then I think we will again thank Gilda
you very much.
Invite the next speaker. introduce Jacob Baxter, who is a PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews, who is looking at the literary career of the English diplomat William Temple. He did his undergraduate and master's degrees at the same institution, and last year he was awarded the postgraduate Gray Prize. Jacob has been a member of the university short title catalog project team since the summer of 2019, and he also works part-time at Topping & Company Booksellers in St. Andrews. So, Jacob.
Thank you, Meg, for that very generous introduction. And I'll start by saying a few more thank yous. My first thank you, of course, goes to the Bibliographical Society and to the Oxford Bibliographical Society for their generosity and, of course, for having me along today. My second thank you goes to the British public transport system for getting me here all the way down from St. Andrews in just one day and in one piece. How could I ever doubt you? And finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you for coming along today, both in the room and online. Good evening. I'd like to begin with a downbeat Scotsman who's far away from home. In 1763, a young, ambitious man by the name of James Boswell went to the Dutch Republic to study law. By this point, the Dutch Golden Age had well and truly faded, as Boswell made clear in a letter to a friend. In such circumstances, this trading nation must be in a very bad way. Most of their principal towns are sadly decayed, and instead of finding every mortal employed, you meet with multitudes of poor creatures who are starving in idleness. You see then that things are very different here from what most people in England imagine. Were Sir William Temple to revisit these provinces, he would scarcely believe the amazing alteration which they have undergone. By the time this letter was written, Sir William Temple, the man at the centre of my PhD research, had been dead for over 60 years. Moreover, the book in which Temple had outlined his fascination with the Dutch Republic, his observations upon the United Provinces, was almost a century old. Yet Boswell still returned to this individual and his writings to outline just how far he believed the Dutch Republic had fallen. Now, Temple is a name that is unfamiliar to most today. And I think to find one reason why this is the case, we need to look no further than that big beast of Victorian Whig history writing, Thomas Babington Macaulay. In a lengthy assessment of Temple, which first appeared in the Edinburgh Review in October 1838, Macaulay argued, Temple is one of those men whom the world has agreed to praise highly without knowing much about them. If the circumstances of the country became such that it was impossible to take any part in politics without some danger, he retired to his library and his orchard, and while the nation groaned under oppression or resounded with tumult and with the din of civil arms, amused himself by writing memoirs and tying up apricots. After over 100 pages of critique, Macaulay summarized his opinion of Temple with neither as a writer nor as a statesman can we allow him any very high place. Temple has never really recovered from this. Whilst the 132 editions by Temple were printed before this acerbic review, only 9 have appeared since. Now, my PhD aims to answer just how well known was William Temple before the 19th century. To put it another way, was Macaulay slaying a sacred cow, or was he already kicking someone while they were down? Today, I'm going to offer a brief overview of Temple's life and work before showing you how I am investigating the popularity of his writings during the early modern period. Now, Temple twice served as England's ambassador to the Dutch Republic between 1668 and 1670, and again after a brief period of retirement between 1674 and 1679. While he was abroad, Temple negotiated the Triple Alliance between England, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic in 1668, the marriage between Mary Stuart and William of Orange in 1677, and the Treaty of Nijmegen between France and the Dutch Republic in 1678. After he returned from the United Provinces in 1679, Temple was appointed to the Privy Council, but 2 years later he was in effect sacked by Charles II in the aftermath of the Exclusion Crisis. Temple lived out the rest of his life in retirement, and in 1689 he took on a young Irishman called Jonathan Swift, as his secretary. Now, Temple died a decade later at the age of 71. During his political career, he had turned down the position of Secretary of State on 4 separate occasions. Now, Temple's life in politics shaped a diverse literary output. Over the course of 4 decades, Temple engaged with a wide range of genre as an author. He produced essays on a myriad of different topics, from improving the Irish economy to curing gout. In 1691, Temple also became one of the first English statesmen to publish a memoir of their time in power while they were still alive. But it is indeed his observations upon the United Provinces which remains his most famous book. In this lively and succinct overview of the Dutch Republic, which was written in 1672, Temple famously described the Dutch as the envy of some, the fear of others, and the wonder of all their neighbours. It is a staple of books on the 17th century Dutch Republic today. The Dutch historian Martin Praag has even argued that Temple's observations are probably the best contemporary analysis of Dutch society. It was also an early modern bestseller on a continental scale. Within 2 years after it was first published in London, another English editions of the observations had been printed, and it had also been translated into Dutch, French, German, and Italian. Yet despite this clear popularity, it is worth stressing that of the 74 editions by Temple that were printed in the 17th century, only 29, that's around 40%, were in fact editions of the observations. In Temple, I believe we have a writer with a broad output which largely goes under the radar. Of course, to work out just how popular Temple was as an early modern author, we first need to know the different ways in which his writings were published in the handpress era. We need to build a bibliography. And over the course of the past year and a half, I've been constructing a bibliography of books by Temple that were printed between 1664, when he published this work on your left, and 1814, exactly 150 years later, when this collection of his works was printed. There are currently 130 different editions by Temple in my database from this period. This more than doubles a previous list for the same period, which was produced by Homer Woodbridge in the 1940s. The editions in my database range from single broadsheets to large multi-volume compendia. Over half of them were printed outside the British Isles. Unsurprisingly, Temple was especially popular in the Dutch Republic, the country which he seldom criticized in his writing. In the United Provinces, he outsold a number of his contemporaries and countrymen, including Andrew Marvell, John Milton, John Bunyan, and John Locke, who actually lived in the Dutch Republic between 1683 and 1689. Today, over 470 libraries in the world have an early modern book by Temple in their collection, and this number continues to grow every week as I work on this database. This process of building a bibliography through national title catalogues, library catalogues, and contemporary references has revealed some really interesting finds. Take, for instance, this book. This is a Russian translation of Temple's essays, which was published in St. Petersburg in 1778. Now, with these bibliographical building blocks largely in place, I'm now looking to examine as many different copies of Temple's books as possible. And this is where I'm especially grateful to the Falkner Madam Award, because Oxford as a city has more books by Temple in its libraries than any other place on the planet, including London. And I look forward to examining as many of those as I can in the coming weeks. Now, why do this? Well, of course, it gives me a chance to transcribe books and also identify even more editions for my database. But it also allows me to examine evidence of readership, and this is crucial in determining Temple's literary reputation. Now, physical additions to books, as I'm sure you all know, including signatures, printed bookplates, stamps, and decorative bindings, offer a fairly reliable way of ascertaining book ownership. For instance, if we look at this copy of the Observations, which you'll find at the John Rylands Library in Manchester, you'll find 4 different owners by just looking inside it. We have 2 individuals, which you can see in the red. We have Charles Wellesley, the great Methodist hymn writer, who got his book in 1755 from an old friend, and his namesake son. But we also can find 2 institutions, Richmond College in Surrey and the Methodist Archives and Research Centre. But also alongside marks of ownership, we can find instances of engagement. For example, in this copy of Temple's Miscellanea from Edinburgh University Library, this copy of Temple's Miscellanea from Edinburgh University Library is strewn with annotations. Below the phrase, the great miscarriages of life come from the want of a good pilot, one reader has written, how true. I wouldn't disagree. Elsewhere in the same book, when Temple discusses the dangers of having large armies, another reader from 1791 has noted how applicable to this present state of France. Now, of course, physical encounters are not the only way of identifying book owners. Book lists, such as auction catalogues, library catalogues, etc., and contemporary references can also point toward different readers. And these three different ways of identifying owners have helped me to construct yet another database of over 250 different owners of Temple's books. And I anticipate that this number will grow considerably when I finally go to Oxford. Now, these include some individuals who had a profound impact upon the political, cultural, and intellectual environments of their day, including Edmund Burke, Thomas Carlyle, Winston Churchill, George III, Robert Hooke, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Samuel Pepys, Leopold von Ranke, Walter Scott, and Adam Smith. But there are others with more modest occupations in there as well, who also owned books by Temple, such as the astronomer John Lee, the Irish noblewoman Anne Acheson, and the Dutch beer brewer Johannes de Planck, who had at least 4 books by Temple in his library. Now, on occasion, these different ways of identifying owners can combine in really interesting ways. Take, for instance, this copy of the works of Sir William Temple, which was printed in 1731. Now, a signature on this clearly demonstrates that it belonged to John Adams, second President of the United States. And Adams's correspondence is, in turn, littered with references to Temple. In one letter from June 1776, which was sent from the exhausting negotiations at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Adams wrote, "When a few mighty matters are accomplished here, I retreat like senators to the plough, and Sir William Temple to his garden, and farewell to politics. I am weary." Now, Adams, of course, went on to represent the United States in the Dutch Republic as it was fighting the British in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Now, Abigail Adams sent a letter of encouragement to her husband whilst he was doing this. "I wish your powers may extend to an alliance with them, and that you may be successful against the artifices of Britain, as a former ambassador was against those of another nation, when he negotiated the Triple Alliance in the course of 5 days. I should add that there is no similarity in the character of my friend and the gentleman whose memoirs I have read with great pleasure." Now, there can be no doubt, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, who the gentleman in this letter is. Oh, and by the way, in the interest of balance, I should add that Thomas Jefferson also had a copy of Temple's works, but it went up in flames in 1851 during the fire that badly damaged its then home, the Library of Congress. Now, Abigail Adams was hardly alone in her admiration for Temple. In 1744, Alexander Pope told Joseph Spence that Temple was an authority on English vocabulary. In 1778, the great lexicographer Samuel Johnson, who mentioned Temple on 54 different occasions in his dictionary, told Boswell that William Temple was the first writer who gave cadence to English prose. Now, today I've outlined you the life, output, and just a few examples of some receptions of an author who has now largely been forgotten. The Bibliographical Society has made an invaluable contribution to my research into Sir William Temple, which I hope will not only shed new light on this fascinating individual, but also provide further insight into early modern authorship and the shaping of literary reputations. Now, I began with a reference to Temple that was written over 60 years after he died. I'll end with one that was written when he was very much still alive. As I mentioned earlier, in 1691, Temple published a memoir. It recounted his trials and tribulations as he helped to negotiate several different peace treaties, which were signed at Nijmegen in 1678 and 1679 between an array of different European powers, including France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and the Dutch Republic. Of course, by the time Temple's memoir was published, these peace settlements had disintegrated with the outbreak of yet more conflict. But for some, this book offered a source of hope. In 1693, the Quaker William Penn published this, an essay on how he believed a European peace could be achieved through either a continental diet, parliament, or a state. And I quote for you now its final paragraph. "To conclude, I have very little answer in all this affair, because if it succeeds, I have so little to deserve. For this great king's example tells us it is fit to be done, and Sir William Temple's history shows us by surpassing instance that it may be done, and Europe, by her incomparable miseries, makes it necessary to be done. My share is only thinking of it at this juncture and putting it into the common light for the peace and prosperity of Europe." Thank you very much. you. Oh, that's very kind of you.
So again, if there are any questions, please just raise your hand and wait for a microphone, or online our secretary will unmute it. So it seems like, a little bit that I can pick up, that some of the later, particularly the late 18th century reading of Temple, with people reading it for parallels in their own situations, whether it was America or France or somewhere. Is that also behind that Russian edition?
Well, that's probably something I'll have to investigate a little bit more when I hopefully go out to Russia and go and see it. But I would imagine so, certainly.
But just from the fact of it even being printed and in
Yeah.
Russia, I mean, is there an introduction or something that makes that clear? You know, why they were publishing it in Russian in 1774?
Well, I believe it's a translation of a German translation of some of Temple's essays. So there may be a link there worth further exploring. As far as I'm aware, I don't think there is actually an introduction to it. It just goes straight in. So yeah, I think that will require a little bit more research there, though.
Such a runaway success over his other works?
Well, first, I think to say to that is it was a big success indeed. I think his memoir that I talked about very briefly at the end does run it close. It doesn't quite become as well translated, but it is still quite popular. But I think the Observations is such a success because two reasons really. One, Temple is very open, unlike a lot of his other works, with putting his name front and center on it. So this is an observation coming from a man who has been at the heart of Dutch politics. This is as good as access as you're going to get. I think that's one reason why it does so well. And another is it is just fantastically well written. I'd recommend it to all of you to read. It's like it reads almost like a travel guide, and its insights are sharp, you know, and fascinating. And that's why I think it continues to appear in many books on the Dutch Republic today. Thank you.
Spoken as a true bookseller as well. I'm sure orders will be coming into topping me companies tomorrow. Yes. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, I think we may then draw the meeting to a close, but I want to just thank our three panelists. Again, thank you so much for coming to join us, and good luck with your research, and we're really proud to have been able to grant you these bursaries and to play some minor role in your progress. So thank you again. So I hope to see many of you on Thursday at the Book That Changed My Life, and on the 30th of November for the first of the Panizzi lectures. Thank you for coming.